Hello and welcome to today's topic. It is modernize and optimize your agency's operations with a unified security and observability platform. Thanks so much for joining the webinar today. We've got a great discussion, a great educational event lined up for you. I want to give a special thanks first, of course, to our sponsors on the event. Thank you to Rubrik and Microsoft for making this event possible. And of course, a huge thanks to the Axotech Media audience for joining us on another awesome webinar event. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the event today. My name is David Davis, and I'll be serving as the host. As always, we want these events to be educational. We want to help you to solve your technology challenges out there in the world of enterprise IT. We know how tough it can be, and so we encourage your questions. We want to make this event useful and helpful for you. We'll be doing a live Q&A session at the end of the event, and we need your questions. We even have a best question prize to maybe help further encourage some of those questions. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But first, I also want to encourage you to check out the handouts tab. It's there that you'll find some great resources, starting off with the link to learn more about how Rubrik and Microsoft support state and local government, followed by a link to register for the Database Protection Summit. And then there's 2 PDFs after that, the download for the 10 tips for government cybersecurity grant proposals, as well as protecting Microsoft Azure and Microsoft 365 for state and local governments specifically. And then finally, there's a link to attend the upcoming data event. So make sure that you check out all those resources there in the handouts tab of your audience console. At the end of the event today, on the live event, I'll be announcing the winner of our Visa $300 gift card. If you're watching this on demand, recorded, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found right there in your handouts tab. And finally, as I mentioned, we also have our best question prize for an additional gift card, another Visa gift card, this one a $50 Visa gift card. This is for the person who asked the best question on the event today. We do this, of course, to help, encourage you to ask more questions. If you've got something on your mind, maybe you're not quite sure if you should ask, please do, and you'll be entered into that prize drawing. We'll be selecting that prize winner after the event. All right, with that housekeeping information out of the way, it's now my pleasure to bring in today's 2 expert presenters. Welcome first to Joe Dabrowski, Regional Vice President at Rubrik, and welcome to Ben Hamill, who is a Director of Strategy at Microsoft. Joe and Ben, it's great to have you on the event. I'll hand it off to you. Take it away.
Thanks, David. It's great to see you, Ben. How you been?
Yeah, great to see you as well, Joe.
Did you have a good holiday?
I did, actually. I did a 5K, which is not normally something I would do, but the gobble wobble for a good charity, I thought that was a good thing to do with my children. And, it turns out I surprised myself. I got it from the beginning to the end. So overall, it was pretty good. How about yourself?
I love it. Yeah, I spent the weekend with my kids at a soccer tournament. So got some turkey in, got some soccer in. Now we're ready to tackle this ransomware pandemic, I guess it depends. Let's dive right into it. Yeah, so really today's talk is all going to be about security at the point of data, how to better respond to these attacks. Hopefully we'll give you some lessons learned in our travels, right, as we've observed organizations who have either efficiently recovered from an event or maybe had some challenges, right? So we're going to call those out, and would love to make this interactive. So would love to see the chat just filling up with, hey, tell me more about this, tell me more about that. So pretty exciting stuff. But before we get to the questions, I want to ask you a question, Ben. Which one are you more worried about? Which one's more likely here? We've got a picture of a hurricane, a kind of classic fire flood thing that IT's been worried about for 50 years, right? And businesses have been worried about for 50 years. And then on the right, we got probably some dude, in his mom's basement hacking away, right? Like, what's more impactful these days? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that natural disasters are tough. You try to plan for them. You try to think about what will happen. You never know the impact they'll have or the intensity they'll have. I think, but every day, especially here at Microsoft, and I'm, this director of strategy here for critical infrastructure. So we look at really what's an attack, what's being attacked every day. And think we have over 1 trillion triggers that we track every day, right? Of something that someone's touching a system or going after and trying to manipulate it. So I think for me, the hacker's more impactful, right? Because that's going to put you in a state of, I don't know when it's going to happen. You can't predict when it's going to happen. And really what you need to do is plan ahead, think through as much as you can, look holistically at your systems to really prepare yourself that it will probably happen, right? It's not a matter of if it will, it's probably will happen. And when it happens, how quickly can you recover? How quickly can you identify exactly the impact that it had? And I think that's what we're going to talk about today, right? Really, it's about, preparing yourself, having the tools in place, working with the right technology partners to address this from all different angles.
Yeah, I think that's really the kind of right approach here. What we've observed is many organizations, because hurricanes, fires, floods, things like that have been known to impact IT and businesses for many years. There's been a desire to build those plans, but we've seen this rapid ascension of bad actors trying to create natural disasters for us, right? And that's happened very rapidly in really the last 4 or 5 years. And many organizations are trying to kind of wrestle with that challenge. Hey, we had a plan for this. Can we use that plan to address this one? What's different about it? Maybe we just don't fail over right away, for example, would be like one thing that kind of go through. But I think what it really boils down to is how probable are these events and how impactful are they, right? So for many years, Ben, enterprise IT has been able to handle what I call operational recoveries, the things that are exceedingly high probability but have a low impact to the organization, right? User deleting a file, a bunch of emails, maybe a virtual machine falling over, something like that, generally absorbed and can recover from, and really there's resiliency around that, right? To the other side, right, the picture on the left here are these, massive events, right? They're pretty low probability, but really high impact, right? I think, probably the most telling example is the space rock falling out of the sky, landing on your data center. It's like perfect shot, right? Probably not going to happen, but if it did, it would be really bad. But when you look at both of these, I think the hurricanes and fires and floods, there's actually something that about them, and that's really the time-bound nature of them. Hey, the hurricane hit at 1 a.m. We need to recover everything to 1 a.m. But now the bad actors, that's a little different, right? We don't know exactly when they got in. We don't know how long they've been there. We don't know what they've done to obfuscate what they've been doing. And so we have to kind of address those before we actually get into the physical recovery side.
Yeah, and I think data integrity is one of the biggest pieces. And, one of the things I've seen, Joe, is that our data collection points have expanded significantly over the last 4 to 5 years too, right? Especially as we talk today about critical infrastructure. Where are those entry points? Where is the data being collected? Where is it being stored? How are you protecting those endpoints from, users accessing them, right? And what I think you said was super important too is it's no longer I came in, I did damage, and I told you about it. We're finding that people are coming in, manipulating the system over time, and then coming back and telling you, I've been here for a while, and guess what? I'm going to, scare you that you don't know how long I've been there and you don't know what I've done, right? So how do we actually think about that in a different manner? We don't know that 1 a.m. that the storm hit idea, right? It may have been for weeks, and they may have started in one place and started expanding out. They may have manipulated data. You need to know that data integrity as well to find those recovery points and what can you do to do that. And backs up restores are one way to do it, but I think we'll talk about some other ways to think about recovery as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, we've got our kind of hands full with the problem statement, if you will. The probabilities are up, the impacts are up, and it's a new type of challenge that, requires some extra steps. So I think that's it.
And I think, we even saw that, in the world today where, invasions into countries, you go into the systems and you want to bring them down, but you also want to create confusion, right? You want to be able to create an opportunity for you to have an advantage over someone else. Taking down critical infrastructures like hospital and water and power, and thinking about all the different things that we just rely on a daily basis. And we need to trust those things because that's what our, economy and our lives are based on, right? And if we can't manage and trust those systems, right, then we're going to have a big challenge ahead of us that we really need to think more deeply about.
Okay. I think this is a good framing up of really the challenge at hand here. So you and I generally hit the road. Sometimes we hit teams quite a bit, right? We're talking to people and organizations all across the country. It's occurred to me, Bennett, this, I guess, protection is a loose term, right? And recoverability or business resilience, organizational resilience doesn't happen overnight, right? And it's not I guess the best way to put it, it's not a destination, it's a journey, right? So, in my travels, I've gathered a lot of feedback, and I'm just going to share with you, it's kind of some of the things we've heard. I'd love to kind of get your take on some of the feedback we get from organizations in terms of, how likely are they, or how prepared are they to recover from one of these events, right? So I think that, kind of the first one that always jumps out of here is, hey, we've done a tabletop. So we're aware of this problem, and many people have, are engaged in helping solve for it. Great first step, no doubt. What else we got? Oh, this one's a little bit more pessimistic. SecOps handles security events, right? Really not my job, right? If you're maybe talking to IT.
Well, even back at the tabletop one, Joe, do you have the right stakeholders at that tabletop exercise? You know what I mean? And I think that a lot of times what I've seen as I work across all our critical infrastructure customers here at Microsoft is, you tend to only bring the IT folks. You tend to think about the people who only manage the data on a day-to-day basis. What I believe is the opportunity, and what we've seen more and more adoption, is bringing the business stakeholders to the table as well, right? They need to understand, what if we don't do something right now? What kind of impact will it have on our ability to deliver power or water, or manage our sewer systems, or manage our traffic or critical infrastructure from, transportation networks, right? So I think that's the other piece that I've seen, is that we've grown out of this IT and started bringing more of those business stakeholders to see what the major impact is going to be. And then, like you mentioned, the SecOps, those events are going to be ones that are the eye opener for a lot of other people to ask them the internal questions. Are we ready?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen HR involved in a lot of these. I've seen, risk and compliance folks. Obviously there's a cyber insurance angle sometimes as well. So there's a lot of cooks in this kitchen, right? What else we got? Oh, it won't happen to us. That's a very optimistic way to look at it. Let's just call it that.
Yeah.
Here you go. Cyber insurance, right? So we got a renewal coming up. It's getting expensive. How do I protect my backup estate, right? Again, more of a journey, not a destination.
Well, and I think cyber insurance is definitely something folks need to consider, obviously, and figure out the risk versus, a reward in terms of what their investments are in something like this. I know that from a ransomware point of view, and that kind of cyber insurance, impacts to your business can be more than just the data that's collected, right? It's your image, it's your agency's ability to be trusted as a deliverer of a critical infrastructure service, right? So, that trust angle is often hard to put a price on, not just the data and the content that's been removed or the insurance has got to cover, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the impact on cities, towns, water districts, what have you, airport authorities, right? It's so big and it's so present, right? We've had organizations that were customers that got, hit, and the police's ability to, know who they're pulling over has been compromised. 911 systems have been down, right? So the impacts are just so large, and, across so many critical services, that it's not just an IT issue, right?
Yeah. And I think, it's a whole, we talk about supply chain these days too, and critical infrastructure provides, like you said, the airports, the rails, the road network to be able to deliver things. And when, a road network is manipulated and you start to create congestions, or you start to create, impacts in there, you also have major investments happening at the federal level. We talked a little bit about this in the recent past, where the Investment Jobs Act, the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, the $1.2 trillion the federal government's putting into place for state and local governments to really secure the critical infrastructure, to use technology to improve that area. A lot of folks need to look at it from a technology point of view, not just from a cement and steel and build better bridges, right? It's about how do we create that resiliency. And when we do that, we're bringing technology and exposing us from now our designs and our builds are online and in a database somewhere, right? And so can people get access to how we've designed our infrastructure? And is that a new threat, right? That's beyond just some of the data we collect in our emails and our files we share, right? So lots of different new technologies as we convert from on-prem to the cloud, or as we convert from paper to electronic, right? There's a lot of new threat points that we want to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think this, to kind of wrap up here on this point is, take stock of where you think you're at, right? There's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of organizations. I think, I'm going to walk you through what we've observed during an anatomy of an attack today. But just know that, again, you can't just check a few boxes on like a attestation form and say, okay, we're now protected, right? It's this constant thing. We're consistently innovating here and iterating on our ability to protect organizational data, right? So the bad guys are continuing to change their tactics, evolve their tactics. I just saw today, Ben, there's massive ransomware attacks in Ukraine ahead of an expected assault by the Russians, right? So it's a precursor to kinetic warfare in many states, right? And you mess around with bridges and tunnels and things like that, and you really can have the upper hand. So,
yeah, and I mentioned earlier too. Something like the city of New York City, it's an island, right? You can change congestion patterns if you can actually manipulate the actual system by knowing when to change particular signals and create congestion that doesn't allow trucks to come in and come off that island, right? You're really affecting people's livelihood because of not being able to provide them with the basic necessities of water and food and things like that. Ukraine just brings it to a whole new level in terms of how this kind of cyber attacks and to some level, the ransomware attacks there are really affecting just all kinds of aspects of our life today.
Yeah. So I think that's a great transition, right? So speaking of being impacted, let's talk about probably one of the most, visible attacks in the last 2 years. I would argue that this attack really changed everything, right? In essence, right? So for, just to quickly recap, and I guess it was probably about a year and a half ago now, Colonial Pipeline was based on the East Coast, supplies a big chunk, about half the nation's, oil, was attacked with a massive ransomware attack. The oil was flowing, but, the IT OT interface became the challenging part where they couldn't really meter the oil flowing, right? So ability to deliver gasoline and things like that was severely impacted, right? To the point where I ran out of gas in my car, right? I was taking my, at the time, my 9-year-old son to a sports event on a Sunday night, and there was no gas. I live in DC, Washington, DC, for 40 miles. I was calling around. I couldn't find it. I'm one of those old school people with a manual stick shift car. So going down hills, I was putting it in neutral and letting the car coast. So I couldn't get gas anymore. So that was, for me, really, that was the first one that impacted me in a massive way. My children's school was also hit with a ransomware attack, and my data was exfiltrated during that event. That happened about 2 weeks after Colonial. So I went through a really bad phase there as a person being impacted by this. What's your take on what happened at Colonial?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned two little terms that would make sure folks here know about. There's IT security, right? So your informational technology, those are the things that we're very familiar with, right? Those are things that, how do I log onto my computer? How do I manage who can access what kind of things? Where is my data source, right? How protected is my data in transit versus in where, how protected is my data as it sits inside my database, storage. What we're finding though is the new layer that you mentioned too is OT security, right? So your operational technology, right? So where are those IoT sensors or Internet of Things where we're relying on knowing exactly what the levels of storage are inside of a gas tank, right? Or an oil tank, right? To know, can we trust that and how does that work? Because based on that information, we're going to make a bunch of other business decisions on how do we do distribution and how do we manage that and how do we protect that. So I think there's a balance for the folks that are out there today to think, don't just think traditional IT security and where your data sits or where you access your data, but think about the source of where your data is coming from and where those are their vulnerability points for where those could be access points for these bad actors, right? To come in and do that. And I think we saw some of that in the Colonial Pipeline is like truly tracing back to where they were and how they got in and what they manipulated. Even to today, I think they were still uncovering things and finding out where things happen. Did we get big enough of the problem solved? Potentially, right? But now you just got to think about, is there other, small landmines still laying around that we got to watch out for and things like that. So to me, one, there was a huge impact on the trust of the system. You talked about the impact of us on a personal level, right? The distribution, something we take, just for granted all the time. I mean, think about your water systems, think about your sewer, thinking about, your power to your house, right? Those are also things that could very quickly be manipulated and could have major effects. And you talk about running out of gas, but talk about not being able to keep food cold and being able to cook your food or be able to live, in the comforts that we're used to today. So critical infrastructure, this is one example, but there's lots of critical infrastructure that we just take for granted today that we all got to protect, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think the thing that jumped out at me most at this was the reaction of, people, right? Obviously, I had a personal reaction. It was massive news all over the world. And it really culminated with the CEO of Colonial being called in front of, a congressional hearing to testify, right? And, I've seen politicians asking questions of this poor CEO, like, did you test your backups? Did you have good backups? Did you have immutable backups? And it was a little crazy for me to hear that, just to be honest, right? I mean, these are not generally board level discussion things, right? But now you've got, mayors, governors, CIOs of water districts and, airport authorities and CISOs getting together and having to answer to the board of directors or, the board of trustees or, whoever, say, hey, if we were hit, could we recover? Right? Have we tested a recovery plan? Have we had that tabletop exercise? Where do we sit with cyber insurance? Right. So, while it was a really impactful thing, this also gave, many organizations kind of a little bit of a cold water on the face scenario to say, man, it's a brave new world. We got to go do something about this. And, the air cover's there now to go have these discussions. Right.
Yeah. And I also think, it woke up a lot of our customers together, right? Where they said, we have a lot of these tools sitting on the shelves, right? We didn't maybe implement them yet, right? We didn't actually put the level of importance on them. Maybe we acquired them. Maybe we started using them for some section of our agency, business, things like that. But how do we actually look more holistically? And you talked about it being a journey, not just a short-term, kind of plan or whatever, right? And I think that's where we're starting to see more, Joe, right? In terms of people getting the idea that I do have to look broader. I have to start looking at what tools do I have in my bag to actually do this with. I don't have to go out and buy new things. Between Microsoft and Rubrik, they have a lot of our tools or have access to things that they can be doing more with today, right? And I think that's what I think Colonial Pipeline realized too, is that it wasn't that they didn't have access to tools. They just hadn't had it coordinated and hadn't thought through it all. And they didn't need to go out and buy a tons of new things per se, right? They didn't do what you said. Put a plan together, practice that plan, execute the plan, and have a point of recovery that's respectable to the services they're delivering. So,
okay. So, on this note, and you've seen, Ben, the after impacts of organizations that were hit, right? I think the thing that jumps out at me the most is just how much go forward progress gets stopped, right? There's these ideas of we want to digitize as many things as digital transformation. We want to move workloads to the cloud, right? We want to get more connected. What happens after an organization's hit to those plans? I think that's something that again, it's jumped out at me, the after impact, right? I think IBM just came out with a study maybe 2-3 months ago that said, the average ransomware event outside of like, if you have to pay the bad guys, is about a $4.4 million event. But the important thing they said there was 50% of those costs were accrued post 1 year after the breach. So again, it's not just the incremental recovery costs right away, or maybe we couldn't recover and we had to pay the bad guys. We had downtime and we had to buy some new tech. There's a long tail there. And it's really slowing organizations down when you look at it on a broader scale than, hey, we're just hit for a couple of weeks. Hey, it impacted our move to the cloud by 6, 12, 18 months.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about that is you could take that conservative route and say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't move that quickly to the cloud. But to be honest with you, the ones we don't hear about, Joe, is the people that didn't have to talk about a ransomware attack. And those folks those types of folks are probably the ones that have already moved to the cloud, right? That have already gone there and used the more advanced technologies, the more monitoring tools, the opportunity to bring more of your data to be, looked at from an AI machine learning point of view on a regular basis, right? The folks that actually do get hit are the ones that have vulnerable systems they can't update, they can't keep track of, they can't keep to the latest versions of other software and technology because they're on-prem per se. So I think what's funny about that statement you just made is I think it's true in some cases where people feel this comfort zone of going back to the way things were, which is everything on-prem and I can hug my servers, right? But the reality is that's a bigger vulnerability. Your recovery capabilities when you're back into that mode are far, far away from what you could be doing once you're fully automated and a bigger piece of your business is actually in the cloud. There's real-time protections and real-time data analytics that are going on that, folks on the call today could really benefit from. Instead of taking a step backwards and slowing it down, they probably should accelerate it. And, speaking selfishly myself, but at the same time, when you think about technology, you can't put enough police around a building, right, to be able to protect it all the time. You need to be able to use the scalability of what everyone else is using. And that's where you get a lot of things from the cloud that I think people should really take this opportunity to accelerate versus step back and think about how do I slow down my transformation.
I love it. I love it. Okay, here, moving on. So, one kind of near and dear to my heart. So probably about 2 years ago, both the city and county of Durham were hit by ransomware attacks over the same weekend. Obviously, these things always happen. I'm actually digging out of a bunch of, data on attacks from this past holiday weekend right now. So, the bad guys are really good at knowing when you don't want to be working. And that's generally when they launch their encryption events. But, so Durham was hit, huge amount of services down, right? The city and county, no 911, fire ambulance, police couldn't go out. I mean, the parking garages wouldn't work because those are connected, right? Talk about IT, OT interface right there. There you go, right? Something as simple as a parking garage, which, is both a revenue generator, but also a public service, right? When the schools go down, parents don't go to work as much, right? Traffic patterns change. So, massive impacts here. But simply put, the city of Durham was a Rubrik customer. Their CIO, Kerry Good, presented to his constituents 72 hours after the attack, talking about how, they had protected backups, right? They had planned for this. They had, made changes to their infrastructure. They ensured that they could always recover. And because of that, the recovery was, hours, right? I think they were done within, a day or maybe a couple of days of cleanup. But most of the critical services were brought up in hours. County, on the other hand, maybe hadn't thought through some of those issues, and their recovery involved, reconstituting data and, rebuilding servers and workstations and what have you. And, that was measured more in weeks, right? So I think this speaks highly to the impact. Now, this hasn't slowed the bad guys down from attacking, the great state of North Carolina, right? So much so that the North Carolina government has passed a law saying you can't pay bad guys as a public entity, public funds, right? So I'd love to hear your take on some of the things you've observed in these type of events.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier the IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. They recently just came out with a $1 billion cybersecurity grant, right? So over the next 4 years, there's $185 million this year, $400 million next year. So the federal government also recognizes this, that state and local government are super vulnerable to these types of attacks, right? And so they're investing. And so, obviously, we both highly encourage all the state and local government customers and education today to look into that kind of funding. But, my opinion is exactly what you talked about, which is cities versus counties versus states, right? They all have a different kind of plan, right? The cybersecurity grant that came out was encouraging collaboration. Share in your practices, share in your technologies, share in your ability to communicate to each other about what you're doing compared to what your peers are doing at the county or the state level, or vice versa with the city, right? And so I think there's more collaboration happening than we've ever seen before, right? That the idea that we're all in this together, right? That state and local government is such a critical impact on all of our lives, right? Just personally as well as professionally. But I think, the way the city handled it and going through and thinking about the tools they had in place, makes everyone understand you can battle against this, or you can have a chance against what's happening. And then you're going to divert the bad guys to look at different ways to manipulate your system, right? And the harder you make it for them, the less impact they're going to have. When you say you can't pay ransomware, like that's one approach, right? The other one is to make sure that you never have to pay for it, right? That you're not in a position to have to even go and make a law around that, right? I think there was a funny take. I read an article recently too, where it was, ransomware is about saying, if you don't pay me, I'm going to go expose your data, right? Well, as soon as you start doing those kind of things, there's actually a code among the ransomware folks too that you don't want to do that, because if you pay and then get released the data, right, then you actually change the whole business dynamics of the way all the ransomware works. So, payment does give you some level of trust. The problem is, again, like you mentioned earlier, Joe, how far did they get? You talk about the county, they're still uncovering places. They're still turning over rocks and finding some more footprints or fingerprints of where this was affected, right? Data integrity just is so hard to go back and trust, right? To really figure out what was that point in time to do it. So you really need to start putting all of your own fingerprints on your data today, right? On where those statuses are and what your plans are, because you really need to have a point in time where you knew you trusted the system, so that when you don't trust the system, you can go back to your own mechanisms to find that. I think between our companies, we really can help them figure that point out, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think, most organizations have probably had some sort of minor event, some sort of scare, or some sort of, hey, this could have been much worse. The question becomes, what action have you taken to mitigate that risk going forward, right? I think in general, many people want to deal with them, right? But the challenge becomes, I call it LODI, right? The law of diminishing intent, right? Another shiny object gets in your way and you move on, right? Like I was saying, there was a bunch of ransomware attacks this weekend that aren't publicly posted yet. I'm looking at one from a very well-known transportation district that may have gotten hit in the past, and they're clearly much better prepared this time. Maybe they bought Rubrik in between, right? But, I'm looking at the recovery now compared to the news stories I read maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's a very different outcome, right? Very similar to what I think the differences are city and county of Durham. So, again, just because you got hit once, there's an 80% likelihood, according to Sophos, that you're going to get hit again, right? Because the bad guys are going to take that knowledge they've gained, probably being in your network for weeks or months, and sell that off, right, to the next band of criminals that want to come hurt you.
Yeah, it was funny too, and we'd like to share a lot of our stories in our travels, right? We do these things called hackathons, right? Where we actually, try to figure out what are your vulnerabilities and walk our customers through that, right? And I think between our two companies, we can show not only your vulnerabilities, but then how to protect against them and use some of the technologies for that. I think we had a recent one by a city here in the U.S. that challenged, hey, we believe we're a solid, secure system, right? How can you break into us? And so guess what? They did an awesome job of managing IT security. They had all their monitoring on. They had figured it all out. They stopped you from IT security. Someone hooked up a laptop to the brand new HVAC system, and that new HVAC system had full administrative rights to the entire network. And because someone said, oh, I want to be able to turn on and turn that off and manage it, and I don't want to have a lot of hoops to go through, so they left administrative rights in there. That's how they came in, and that's how they then started setting all of their little bit of fingerprints, and then eventually it just starts to grow and grow and grow. So I point back to cities again, when you start putting in, advanced traffic management systems where you're actually looking at controlling your signals of your traffic lights, right? I mean, for $6 or $8, I can go to eBay and buy the key that opens up that box that connects to that signal, but you have it on your network now. So there's so many vulnerability points of entry points that you need to figure those things out, so that when our two technologies come into place and we can help you recover from that or monitor them, you're ready to look for the anomalies that could happen.
Awesome. Okay, here, moving on. So kind of last story I'll tell is one around a pretty well-known major airline that never came out that they were hit, right? So this is probably, if you want to go back to that, I think the second slide where I had those funny quotes, right? They were way off to the right, right? This is an organization that drilled this, right? They had a plan. They tested the plan. They understood that they probably need an isolated recovery environment, and they probably need to preserve evidence and all those things that are, the more 201, 301 level concepts, right? So the impact here was, yeah, sure, there was a 30-minute ground stop, but full operational recovery in under 4 hours. We've seen, organizations struggle to get up and running in weeks or months, right? There's some well-known counties and school districts right now that have been very publicly attacked in the last couple of months, and services are still impacted. So, I think this is about where we want to get to for 2022, Ben. They're a hybrid estate, right? They leverage the cloud in this case. again, had a plan, they documented a plan, they clearly tested the plan, they ran the plan. Clearly, more than just IT and security were involved. So, I mean, it's about what good looks like in my estimation. What's your take?
Yeah, absolutely. When you take a look at the tools they had in place, they did leverage technology. They did, because you can't have enough resources of people these days, right? So having educated, trained individuals to even know all of what's out there and what the capabilities are and things like that, it's just not an opportunity these days, right? We just don't have enough workforce to do that, especially in state and local government, where we're not attracting the type of security analysts and the types of folks that maybe we need in state and local government to help us with this challenge, right? So you do need to lean on technology folks like ourselves, right? So our companies that can bring you that force multiplier, that can give you those monitoring tools and those recovery points and the tools you need for the data resiliency and recovery, so that you can, again, force multiply your folks. And I think that's another piece where the cloud and the technologies and the scalability and the investments that are being made at the customers we're dealing with today, right, really can benefit all of us and really bring us to this point where, you know, you're talking about a commercial entity that's doing things, right? So now you're talking about how do we get to there? I also think, you know, it's funny, we expect so much out of our government because of the levels of customer service we get in our daily lives, right? When we walk into place, we just expect the stores to be open. We just expect them to take the payment method that we want to use, right? We expect them to have the thing we want in stock because they're doing analytics on us and they know when we're coming to do it. Our governments are catching up, right? Our state and local governments, for the services that they're doing, they're really getting to realize like they need to be at that same level, right? They need to provide a service at a citizen level that doesn't, you know, have major impacts on our lives. We need to feel protected. We need to have our ability to do business with governments, you know, our individuals, and have that trust that we're not going to be part of a ransomware attack, because it goes beyond just what's stolen or taken from the agencies, right? It's where is that being used and what could it be doing to affect my life even outside of my relationship with that agency, right?
Yeah, very much true. And that it doesn't go away in a couple of weeks either, right? That data lives on in the public forum for years and years. And
and yeah, the other thing I like to talk about too, Joe, is like here at Microsoft, obviously we have things like Xbox and we have these things called Outlook.com, where you think about state and local government, like that's a beneficiary of how we're seeing the attacks all across the world. You know what I mean? Like we're seeing them in all commercial entities on a given basis. And what we do as a company, and between our two companies, is we bring that experience and that technology and the AI, ML, and the tool sets, right, down into the state and local governments so they can benefit from all of that intelligence that we gain from what's happening across the rest of the world, right? And so I think that's another reason that, you know, when you have two solid companies like ourselves, like Rubrik and Microsoft, right, working together so tightly with our integrations between our products and things like that, like that's a 1 + 1 = 3 relationship for all those state and local governments that are listening today, right? That gives an opportunity to say, look at that journey, look at the comprehensive approach. I think that's an important thing to think about.
yeah, no, it's a great point, right? Compared to what we're up against, this is exactly what needs to happen, right? So, you know, I think many, people understand that, listen, if the nation state actor wants to go after you and your data, they're probably going to eventually find a way in, right? It's just, it is what it is, right? They've got probably unlimited resources in the grand scheme of things, right? And unfortunately, and we call these advanced persistent threats or APT actors, right? We've seen them rear their heads quite dramatically in the last couple of months, right? Where they've been kind of laying quiet for a while there, but they've attacked some state offices, they've attacked some websites. They're absolutely going after critical infrastructure type things, right? So we got to worry about them. But then the higher probability of being hit are what we call the RAS gangs, or the ransomware as a service gangs. And what they do are, it could be some of the same people, right? The nation state actors, they've just gone off on their own with their buddies and they steal the software or rent the malware. They rent cloud services, right? They constantly shift their ownership records to kind of stay ahead of everyone. And, you know, their job is to pull as much money out of you as possible, as quickly as possible, right? So we've got both sides of this that we have to guard against. So, you know, you need your vendors to work together to, one, you know, quantify the entire threat, and two, make it easy for you to consume ways to mitigate that risk, right? And I think that's what we're doing so effectively here. So let's move on, Ben. You know, security at the point of data is a new concept as far as I'm concerned. what we're talking about here, right, with the solution that Rubrik brings to market with Microsoft is really a more modern backup solution that has many of these security capabilities really built in from the ground up, right? So that's the difference, I think, between legacy backup and what kind of Rubrik and Microsoft can bring to the table is, this was built for this fight, whereas legacy backup wasn't, right? Legacy backup was built for, hey, we need to back up a lot of things, or we need to back up virtualized workloads now via APIs, or, heck, Ben, this, the entire design point behind legacy backup was put the repositories on the network so everyone can get access to them. That was the design point right there. And now the bad guys are like, yes, keep doing that so we can keep finding them and compromising them, right? So, those old kind of paradigms go out the window. So, this is my point of saying, listen, data's got gravity. Security at the point of data is different than all the things you're doing infrastructure, right? It doesn't replace your firewalls or any SIM tools, any observability suites, anything like that. It simply hardens your backup environment to make sure you can always recover, gives you recovery capabilities in the cloud that are more enterprise ready than maybe like you maybe were used to on-prem, and then gives you that plan that help you actually recover it. It's not just, can I recover it? It's how do I actually do this? Who's involved? What steps do we take? Can we maybe even document it and test it and demonstrate, to the mayor, the governor, the board of directors that we can actually pull this off?
Yeah, I think you mentioned another good point there is like, if your servers on-prem were hacked or they were, were manipulated, right? You can't just go buy in today's world another set of servers and just go back up and running again. It's hard to even get servers in itself with our supply chain challenges that we're doing right now with the chip challenge and things like that, right? Thinking more about that hybrid or even move to the cloud, like someone's going to say you need to be up and running as quick as you can. Like you can't go wait until you procure things and go wipe things clean and start from scratch. Like you need to have quick turnaround, right? I think that's where our two companies go together, right? So I think that's where we can do all that advanced monitoring and let you know something happened. And then how do we then say, what do we use in terms of infrastructure and tools from a hybrid environment to the cloud recovery to the different tools to say, all right, we've detected it. Now what do we do, right? How do we execute against that plan to get you back up and running as quick as possible, right? I think that's a super important part.
Yeah, so this is all about, again, we've built tall walls around our estates, right? We paid for the hawks to watch the castle, right? So they're watching for things that shouldn't be going on the inside. But the reality is, the food store in the castle is the most important thing, right? And if we can't protect that last line, we're in trouble, right? And we'll lose the faith of all those in the castle around us. So that's really it. So let me walk us through kind of what we've observed, right? So Rubrik, just so everyone knows, we've got about, I think globally 6,000 customers. We've got about 600 public sector customers here just in the Americas, right? So we've grown very rapidly. Every week at Rubrik, we see anywhere from 3 to 5 attacks. This weekend was much busier because we've got a support center that jumps on these things, right? It's called the ransomware recovery team, and they are your best friends, a conduit, if you will, for if and when you're hit. Will help coordinate with cyber insurance and your incident responder and tell you the best practices needed to recover. So we've observed a lot. So the bad guys are getting in, generally phishing, RDP exploits. But I mean, Ben, you've seen this too. There's initial access brokers on the dark web where you can basically buy your way into anyone's network for hundreds of dollars, maybe 1,000, right? So the reality is if somebody wants to get in, they'll get in. We just talked about this. You've got really kind of two options, right? You can, pay the bad guys, right? Which only perpetuates the problem, maybe makes it go away. But again, what we've observed here is you don't always get all of your data back, and you definitely don't get your data back immediately. It's not like you're just like, hey, let's recover, it decrypts it and it runs, right? Colonial, it would have taken them, I think, weeks to actually decrypt the data because the decrypting tool wasn't great. So, if mean time to recovery is your metric, paying the bad guys might not get you there. So let's focus our conversation here on recovery. So in order to recover, you really need to engage at least two parts, right? And this is, again, part of that plan we talked about earlier. But, IT ops owns backup and recovery tool sets. They often own the systems and the plans. And security ops job is to put a fence around the state, figure out what happened, how do we have trust, right? So they got to work together. In my travels, sometimes it's one small team of people. Sometimes there's silos of teams that, like, I don't even know who's over there, right? Or, that type of thing. So we have an organizational challenge sometimes. But we got some really hard questions we need to ask ourselves. So the first question, and I think many people are aware of this, is my data protected? Can I recover it? With 80+% of the attacks involving compromise the backup estate first, have we done enough to harden our backup estate? Right? Ben, this is generally where you hear, hey, we'll air gap things, we'll make them immutable, we'll be good, right? But that's not all of it. For example, NTP attacks. We've seen a bunch of NTP attacks here where the bad guys have used NTP by forwarding it as an effort to roll off all the backup retentions, right? Who cares if your backups are immutable if they all expired?
Right, exactly.
Like, oh, wow, that can happen. The next thing we have to figure out is, if you think about it, there's going to be some sort of blast scenario, right? At some point, this malware is going to wake up and start, I call it play Pac-Man with your data, right? Start eating away at your data. Do we have a capability to undo what was encrypted? Do I have a tool that tells me exactly what to recover? Because again, this is a different type of recovery where maybe somebody did some things to obfuscate what they've done. So do I want to take the time to do that by hand? Ooh, that could take a while. Or do I just want to recover all my data? That could take a while too. Recovery time is my metric. How long is it going to take me to figure out that problem? But I have another problem, Ben, that's even harder. The bad guys are generally in your environment for some time before the malware wakes up, right? So you might have a history of backups with malware all over it. So if you go to get a backup image and drop it in your new pristine production environment, there's a high probability that there could be malware in there, and that malware could wake up and play Pac-Man again. So how do we ensure we're starting a clean recovery? Do I have a tool that will literally clean out the backups in real time without recovering them and just not recover the malware files? Then the bad guys have realized that, hey, there's companies like Rubrik out there that always ensure they recover. So how do I make them pay? Well, we're going to exfiltrate data. It's called a double extortion attack, right? We're going to take the data out of your four walls. And then we're going to say, hey, Ben, even if you do recover, I saw some Rubrik thing floating around. We're going to post it on the dark web. And then, your constituents are going to be really mad at you for letting your data go. So how do we, one, know if there's sensitive data in our environment that hasn't been properly tagged or encrypted? And two, after a blast, how do we know what they took? Because that might change how we respond. Then I have to figure out, honestly, where I want to recover to. Do I have an isolated recovery environment? Maybe I'll fail over to DR, maybe not. Do I want to maybe launch in cloud? Oh, wait, I've got cloud repositories of backup data that maybe did I do enough job to protect those in Azure? Right? So we got this large surface area on top of it, but what is my plan? What applications do I want to bring up first? What order of operations are they? Is that tested? Is it automated? Can I bring them up in a bubble network? All these things are really hard to solve for, and it goes much deeper than just, air gapping and immutability. Did I miss anything there that you've observed?
No, I don't think you missed anything, and I'm just being sensitive because I know folks want to ask some questions. But I think I go back to a point I mentioned earlier, is that you have a lot of these tools already. So when Rubrik and Microsoft are in your environment, what you just said is more about coordination and use of those tools rather than, what am I missing? As we're not talking about missing tools. We're talking about how to leverage your investments already probably better, right? Or looking how to fill some of those tool gaps, right? But I think that's important to understand, is that, a lot of this is coordination and bringing the right stakeholders to the table to understand just, can we trust? And what I found too, Joe, which is interesting you mentioned earlier, is when you bring in the IT ops folks and SecOps people, like sometimes they don't even know each other in some organizations. They're just so big, right? And so they're going to have conflicting plans to how to even attack that too, right? So you have to have a mediator of some sort to say, look, you could take that approach. It's going to take a really long time. You could take this approach, take less time, but have us more exposed, right? So you're also going to think about what is the right balance between, speed to recovery with, accuracy and trust, right? So, and that's where I think the business owners also need to come to the table too, and really have the conversation about, all right, should we take another day? And yes, it'll hit us harder from a services point of view, but it will give us a better position to be in once we come back up and running, right? So I think there's really 3 legs to that stool, maybe a 4th leg too, with compliance and legal too, right? So I think those are all things I would think about as you go through this. But this is a great breakdown, in my opinion, about just, at a high level, at least, what you need to think about as you go through these kind of incidents.
Okay, awesome. Here, moving on quick. So here's actually how Rubrik and Microsoft can help, right? So the first pillar, the left side, is all about protecting that hybrid estate and ensuring you can recover, right? Whether it's on-prem, cloud native, M365 workloads, which, are becoming a favorite target of the bad guys, unfortunately, right? Then, the observability side of it, we answer all those hard questions that, maybe will catch you off guard, right? How do we know we get clean copies? How do we know what data was impacted? How do we know what sensitive data was exfiltrated? Those type of things. And then it's all about, how quickly can I recover this? Can I do it in an automated fashion? Is this something we can demonstrate and test? So that's really what we bring to the table. Again, we've got a lot of experience with ransomware events, seeing what happens and seeing organizations that are prepared or not. So the last thing I'll leave you all with is maybe a little bit on how to learn more, right? So obviously, my team, Ben's team, would love to come out and have a discussion with you about this and customize a plan. But another way we've done this is we've created this event called Save the Data. What Save the Data is a 2-hour, roughly about 90 minutes to 2 hours, tabletop scenario kind of screenplay, if you will, right? You go through a ransomware attack, playing a persona within a retail organization who's hit on Cyber Monday. Great timing, right? And you get to play various personas. You get to see the board level meetings, kind of what happened, undo it. The best way to put it is this one's free, right? You get to go through a ransomware attack without any of the bright lights on you. You get to learn some hard lessons, some things you might want to do better. So you are better prepared if and when you get hit. So we've got these virtually. We've got them all over the country. There's only a handful left in this fiscal year, but we're going to do another 50 or 60 of these as we get into 2023.
Yeah, and I think that's a great opportunity, because it is almost an aha moment when we see these happening, right? Where people realize, like, oh, I thought I was good until you gave me that curveball, or you gave me that scenario, or you gave me that idea, right? You talked about the journey to the cloud and where folks are in that process, right? And understanding, do we need to accelerate certain parts of it so we can protect against ourselves to be able to recover quicker, right? And maybe it's a reprioritization. So some of the outcomes of these things can be looking at your prioritizations of your projects, and how do I get certain, critical components of my infrastructure to the right place under the right conditions as I move different, workloads up. Because we can't just pick up everything and put it in the right place all the time, right? We got to figure out, what do we have money for? What do we have resources for? And how do we do that? And I think that's a great outcome from these events. And I highly recommend we do these more with the folks that are on the phone and reach out, because it's a great opportunity for you to just, consider where you are today, even if you feel comfortable. If you don't feel comfortable, that's obviously a different approach. But even if you feel comfortable, these are great events to engage us on, and to do a inventory of where you are and where you might want to be when you start addressing some of these challenges.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to, Ben, it's been a really fun discussion for me today. I want to thank you. You gave me some great insights and some beautiful points you were made. So it's been awesome, dude.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it too, Joe, because I think a lot of times we talk too much, sometimes down at the product level and the bits and bytes and the configurations and things like that. I think people need to bring it up a level to really realize what we're trying to solve for, right? What are the things that, we have to think about the impacts of these, not just, how do I, once I know about it, what do I recover? You got to think about the entire journey, right? And I think that's a great way you started it with, and a great way to just kind of sum it up here at the end. But thanks a lot, Joe. This is a great thing. So I think we may have some questions here from Dave. David, do we have any questions that you want to bring into the conversation?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what an incredible discussion. You all have obviously hit a hot button issue here with the audience. I mean, we've got 5 minutes left and about 70 questions. So I'm sure we're not going to have time.
I couldn't see him. I would have stopped sooner. Oh man, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. That's all right. You all covered so much great information. So yeah, with just a few minutes left, I'm just going to pick a few here that caught my eye that look like really good questions. So The first one I wanted to ask here, they're asking, what are the top causes of a successful ransomware attack?
So the top causes of a successful attack or a recovery, I think.
Well, I think those are both, good angles to that. So what was the number one reason that people ended up infected with ransomware?
Phishing.
What could they have done that phishing? Okay.
Yeah. Somebody clicking on something stupid, right? Millions of dollars in investments in security, process, people, and technology. All it takes is one click.
And it's so true. And it's socially manipulated too. I mean, it seems they've done such a great job these days of making it look so perfect. And, I know internally here to Microsoft, we go through lots of training on phishing just to try to recognize these things and be more aware. And I think in our daily lives, we have this thing called junk mail, where most of that, we believe that's where all of it goes. But that's based on intelligence too. Like that's where technology can start to, monitor what is coming through on your phishing attacks, right, and to detect them before. So I think phishing is, I definitely agree with you, Joe, is probably the number one that's the cause of these ransomware attacks or entry points, right?
Right. Yeah. Good to know. Okay. Next question. They want to know, does Rubrik encrypt backups to protect them from the malicious attackers?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything's encrypted by default. There's no ability to turn it off. Right. We don't have a safe mode or anything like that you can turn on, because you can turn it off. Right. So everything is natively built in from the ground up. The air gapping is part of our file system. The immutability is part of the file. Like, that's how we built it. It's a zero trust architecture under the covers.
Yeah. And I think what's also important about that, Joe, is that the encryption keys you used. So when you start to go to look at data and you can't unencrypt it, that means that it wasn't done by Rubrik. You can quickly identify where things have been manipulated or tainted, right? So I think that's another piece that when you have a solution like Rubrik, you actually can now know with trust how that was encrypted or not encrypted because you did it, right?
Yeah, 100%. And, again, we use ML on the back end, so we know, what good changes are versus, anomalous ones. And, the bad guys have gotten really good. I mean, some of the new encryption techniques involve only changing a handful of bytes in a single file just to compromise them instead of spending the time to encrypt the whole thing. So you definitely need some machine tools to help you with this process.
Excellent. And then when it comes to the recovery, this is a very long question. I'll just try to rephrase it as, how can they get, really short RPO and RTO? How can they get rapid recovery across thousands of virtual machines? Is it possible to really scale to that?
Yeah, 100%. You need automation, right? So one, you need to ensure you can always recover. So let's just start there. You have to have really good backups that, are protected on a variety of fronts, right? From there, you need to understand what data you need to recover. Because if you're trying to recover, all of the data for thousands of machines, it's going to take too much time, right? And if you have to manually figure out what data to recover, it's going to take too much time. If you have to redo your recovery because you maybe inserted malware back, it's going to cost you time, right? If you don't have an isolated recovery environment and you need to build one, that could cost you time during this. And it could be almost impossible if you don't actually have the physical hardware. To Ben's point, there's lead times for this stuff now, right? I heard of one organization that begged, borrowed, and stole 60 servers for their ransomware attack and then used their corporate jet to fly them to all 60 sites. I'm not sure how many local governments have a corporate jet laying around that can do that, right? So it all comes down to mitigating as much time as possible by asking yourself these really hard questions now, so you have a plan when it's go time.
Really wise, really excellent advice. I'm afraid we're out of time here. We've reached the top of the hour. So many great questions still left from the audience. We'll have to get back to those after the event. But I do want to give a big thanks to Ben from Microsoft and Joe from Rubrik. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been great to be here, David. Thanks a lot.
And thank you to the audience, of course, for joining us. Before you go, don't forget about the handouts that are there in your audience console, where you can learn more about how Rubrik and Microsoft support state and local governments. There's excellent resources, excellent downloadable guides there, and then the link to the Data Protection Summit, as well as the Save the Date event that's coming up. So make sure that you check out those resources. And then with that, it's my pleasure now to announce the winner of our Visa $300 gift card. This is going out to Rob Brasinger from North Carolina, it looks like. Congratulations to Rob Brasinger. We'll reach out to deliver that gift card, and also to our best question prize winner as well. Have a great day and stay safe. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.